Well, hello, friends, and time for another episode of Uncertified, our bi weekly, new ish podcast release at Certified Forgotten. If you're new to Certified Forgotten as a website or as a podcast, a quick reminder that our bread and butter is the main feed where we talk about horror films with 10 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. It's about an hour long. We have incredible guests that join us every week, every other week. But Uncertified is our it's our spinoff. It's our Joey to Friends. It is the opportunity for us to talk about films that still stick with the ethos of undiscovered, underappreciated, underrated horror, but don't come with the low search volume and the lack of general interest or wherewithal from our audiences. My name is Matt Monagle, one half your Matt hosts. I'm joined, as always, by my friend Matt Donato. How you doing, Matt?
I am very tired because I'm coming off an entire Memorial Day weekend of Vegas and wrestling shows and events and thingies. So the come down is hard. The crash is inevitable.
That's true. That's what happens when you go to Vegas. And you were in the front row of some sort of like AEW recording. Did I see that correctly?
Yeah, so we went to the pay-per-view Double or Nothing in Vegas and we had great seats and we're like, holy shit, how can we like top fourth row at a pay-per-view? And then we show up for our, we knew where our seats were for Dynamite last night and we did Dynamite and Rampage. They shoot together two AEW shows. So, we get about 4 hours worth of wrestling in there. And we show up and literally we're second row on the entryway ramp. There's only four people in our row. There's no one in front of us because the front row is literally just two seats. And it was the best experience I've ever had at a wrestling event. I was just like on the ring, not the ring apron, obviously, but like the guardrails around the ring on camera side, just hanging out, just leaning in, high-fiving wrestlers, talking shit to wrestlers. Like it ruined me for future events because I can probably never get those seats again. But the luck of getting those and like actually having that experience. So I'm still riding that high from last night, which is going to make the come down like even harder. It's going to just like tumble like a snowball.
Well, I'm glad, knowing what I know now about where you're at emotionally. I'm glad that we are sneaking this podcast recording in because I want to have a good conversation about this movie. I think we're going to have a great conversation about this movie. We promised to get it done in 30 minutes or less. That's the whole point of Uncertified. Um, but we could maybe bring a little bit of that, like that front row energy to talking about In a Violent Nature, right? Like that's something we could do.
Yeah, definitely not forgotten. Going along with our our
Correct.
side piece conversations. In a Violent Nature is in everyone's mind. It's just getting its release in theaters and will come to Shudder later on. But yeah, I'm ready to bring it. I saw this as Sundance. I didn't see it at Sundance. I saw it as part of Sundance back in January, and I've really been excited for the general public to start really like diving into this one
Hmm.
because I'll just get things started anyway, and we'll jump right into it.
Well, let me do a quick plot
Okay,
synopsis,
you know what? All right, let's not. You do your thing.
we got to do the formal thing real quick.
You
For
do the
those of you
formal.
that have not seen it, which I assume opening weekend in America is probably a lot of you. Quick rundown: takes a special sort of person to pocket a personal belonging from a grave site. So, when a group of 20-something campers steal the locket from the grave of Johnny, the region's most notorious serial killer, his sudden reincarnation feels like the horrible hand of fate. In a Violent Nature, the premiere film from writer-director Chris Nash, adopts a naturalistic aesthetic, following Johnny through the woods as he seeks revenge. And along the way, the hapless campers will learn the true history of Johnny and the sacrifices the community made to put him in that grave to begin with. There you go. That's the sales pitch. Donato, continue.
Yes, so jumping into what I was saying, I was really excited for everyone to start seeing this movie because I am so curious how it's going to be received overall. I understand every reaction to this film from it is the reinvention of slashers that I've been dreaming of. I am so excited this movie exists, 10 out of 10, to 0 stars. What the fuck did I just watch? That is a one joke, one gimmick kind of flick that has no backing or substance, 0 to 10. And I am on the positive side. I absolutely am. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5. That is a solid, good movie rating. We're above okay. We're above that mediocre. We're
Hmm.
doing great. But I'm just, I'm really curious to see how other people take this in. So like, I want to hear from you first. I know generally that you enjoyed this film a good deal. I've read your social media reactions, but like, let's get into that because, tell me why you fucking love this thing so much. I want to hear that first.
Yeah. So, In a Violent Nature, not a film that you would sort of think of. I think by now I've probably earned a little bit of my stripes. Donato and I actually both like slashers. Slashers are sort of an interesting common ground for the two of us, where, Donato, you love the gore elements, and I love sort of like the maximalism, the most of that a lot of slashers play with. So it's a weird, surprising point of confluence for how you and I talk about horror. But I'm still me, right? Like my ideal version of a horror film, the thing that I'm going to love, is tone and atmosphere above all. And so I loved In a Violent Nature. I thought it was great. I'm going to be really shocked, given that Long Legs is in its own rarefied, like it's its own thing. It has its own suite in the Hall of Fame. Like I don't even need to worry. I haven't seen it. That's on a different conversation, different level. Among the non-Oz Perkins movies of 2024, I would be really shocked if this wasn't my favorite horror film of the year, because it does all of the things that I like on both sides of the genre. It does slow burn atmosphere. It does, the like it allows a slasher to unfold at medium or long shots, right? Like kills happen from 100 feet away as opposed to up close and personal, which I love. The best thing you can do to get me hooked on a movie is have kills happen at a distance, because I just think that shows so much confidence and so much craft as a filmmaker to make that stuff look good. But it also has some moments of extreme gore. Like I described, we're not going to say what it is. I described the best kill in the movie to multiple people that vowed they would never see the film after that. Folks that I knew probably weren't going to be able to stomach it anyways. But like it is the sort of thing where if you've seen Bone Tomahawk and you think of like the visceral reaction you got from the wishbone scene, it's on that level of a gore sequence. You're just like, oh shit, they did the thing. So it kind of grabs from a couple of different things that I love about horror, is that it has complete confidence in tone, complete confidence in storytelling through action, but also isn't afraid to swing for the fences, to do those maximalism things. And it all comes together so beautifully for me.
Yeah, I think number one, perspective is everything, and the subversion of approaching a slasher from the perspective of the killer is so incredibly unique. I think the film sustains that angle for almost the entire runtime. I'll get to that a little later, but like, just if we're just talking the positives and what you're just like saying there, Monica, like number one, I do think this film, it's kind of like if you watched Jaws and you strapped a GoPro to Bruce the Shark, and that's how you saw Jaws, just through his perspective the entire time. And I do want to say that as both a like enthusiastic recommendation for slasher fans who have been dying for something different, and to see something that is smartly written and really like takes care of every trope and every commonality we see in slashers. It's all in here. We see it analyzed, we see it dissected, and again, it's from a really interesting point of view. So I really did like that part of it, which is the whole movie, of course. And I also, going with your gore comment, I mean, like, this is Chris Nash's feature debut,
Yep.
but it doesn't play like a debut because he has been behind the scenes on so many films, from like Psycho Goreman and other films of that ilk, just doing makeup and just doing effects. So like, he's been on sets, he's been working hard. And if you've seen the ABCs of Death 2, he is Zia's for Zygote, which I think ends that little anthology. Well, I shouldn't say little, it's quite a big anthology.
Yeah.
But it ends it with a bang, and it ends it with a bang particularly because of the practical effects. So I was never surprised by that kill you're talking about. All the kills go hard, but that kill in particular, there's almost no chance it gets dethroned for my Fangoria list at the end of the year when I do the best kills of the year.
Yeah.
I can't see anything this year being better than that. And if something is better than that, then holy shit, that's going to be an amazing kill, because this one's already like top tier. I haven't seen something like this in a while. So those are all the good things. I will admit, though, I did deduct points towards the end, because for how much momentum the film has building into the breakdown of slashers and everything that is clever about it, from the sound design, you don't hear the campers talking until you get close enough to be an earshot of the killer. Like, we are truly the killer. Everything is taken into consideration on the technical abilities, but the way the film does linger at points, I know that is intended. I know that's exactly what was wanted by the filmmaker, but it does drag at points for me. I am one of those people that does lean a little more towards the could have had a little bit of cutting here and there just to like trim this down, because it's an experiment. This is an experiment of a film that is done way better than a lot of other experiments that go awry. But that last scene in particular for me, when we just have the conversation in the car, I know what it's trying to convey, and I know what it's trying to get across in telling the final girl arc story and all those things. But holy shit, that scene felt like 20 minutes alone for me, and it just killed some ending momentum. I think it had a really clear, shouldn't say really clear, but I think there was another point that would have been really awesome if it ended on. And instead it took that next step and it felt like it just started like the wheel started slowing down and we weren't at the end yet. And I was like, oh no, please go. No, wait, please get off. Like I wanted to be let off the bus a little earlier. I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah. I want to hold on to that. I want to talk about the ending at the ending because I surprised myself by really liking it after not being sure if I liked it or not. I thought about it a little bit and I have a perspective, capital A, capital P, a perspective on that. So let's circle back to that in a second though, because I kind of want to hit on some of the stuff that you were talking about with regards to the killer's POV. I think one of the things a lot of people have said, oh, you follow the killer, that like it's from the killer's perspective, and that's not it's mostly true, right? Like you know that, but the film never actually adopts a first person perspective. It's always a third person perspective. For a lot of the film, it almost feels more like you're, playing a Red Dead Redemption type character, that like over the shoulder third person camera. You very rarely see the killer's face, and most of the time you're just sort of following him from behind as he moves around different spaces, kind of in real time, which like you said, is going to piss some people off, but I fucking loved. But I think that as obvious and as silly and as simple of a creative decision as that is, the idea to not move into the first person, the idea to keep that little bit of a distance allows us to empathize with the character of Johnny, I think, in a way that we couldn't otherwise, right? Because we're not in his head. We're not seeing what he's seeing. We're not focusing on what he's focusing. So we are not making aspersions about, like what his motivations are and what's drawing him. We're seeing him react. We're seeing him hear a noise and walk towards a noise. We're seeing very, very base animal instincts, seeing all of this happening from behind. And there's a level of distance that brings to the character, which paradoxically made me feel, I don't want to say closer to the serial killer character, but I was more invested in him because I wasn't supposed to occupy his space. I was just sort of observing what he was doing and a little bit along with him for the journey. So I am curious if you felt the same way, that third person perspective of the killer was a better decision than how this might conventionally and normally be shot, either first person or just sort of like here's a killer in a movie.
Yeah, I as a gamer, like as someone who plays these games, like I am a first person shooter kind of person over the shoulder. I was
Yeah,
never Gears of War. I was always Call of Duty to say.
gotcha. Okay.
Um, but with that said, I think for the storytelling and what Nash is doing here, it is important that we're over the shoulder. I like the lurking sensation of watching the killer Johnny from behind because it does feel like we are watching over his shoulder. And I think it is important for what is happening to kind of remove ourselves a little bit from Johnny. We don't want to be
Mhm.
in his head. This isn't found footage. This isn't something like Maniac, let's say, the Maniac
Yeah.
remake,
Yeah.
where we literally are in Elijah Wood's head. Like we hear the thoughts, we hear everything. And to properly comment on everything that In a Violent Nature is, because it's more a commentary on slasher films itself than the slasher villain, we need to see it from a little bit of a removed standpoint. So I think that is correct. This would not have been as good if we were inside the killer's body, operating like a video game or something of that nature.
Yeah.
That would have been a different In a Violent Nature kind of film. Would it have been successful? I think so. I think there's definitely something behind the idea of going first person POV on a killer. Like again, like Maniac is one of my favorite remakes, one of my favorite horror movies
Hmm.
that have come out since then. The remake, to be clear, but that's not the movie that this wanted to be, nor had to be. I think there's some really sincere moments when Johnny is shown full view. We see his face, we see his body, like from the front side. And there's also some really good workaround moments where you can only follow from behind him so much. You do need a little suspense and surprise at times
Yeah.
where we do lose Johnny. Like the camera loses Johnny, whether it's for a few seconds or a few minutes or something of that nature. And in those small moments, you do build a little bit of tension back. You do build a little bit of the regular quote unquote nature of slasher films that keeps our excitement a little up. But I think for me, the coolest aspect was the sound design that I mentioned before. I really like the idea of watching a slasher film comment on the fact that how many of these slasher films are filled with that like campfire bullshit, all those
Mm-hmm.
things, the telling of stories, the filler. It's to see it done from the killer's perspective where he doesn't know, like he's not maliciously seeking out the right moment for these kids. He literally just walks up when he walks up and slaughters. Like there's no kind of like, I'm gonna wait until he's done with his dialogue or wait until she's done running here or doing that. I really thought that was so clever. And to use sound to let it like kind of like be muted until you get close enough and you hear just a passing snippet of a story that's so dumb. We don't need it. It's over there.
Yeah.
It can stay over there. So I think it was really important to do things like that. It was really important to blend the line between first person POV and the perspective we get, but again, still remain behind, still remain bird, parrot, shoulder. We're along for the ride versus we are complicit.
Yeah, and there's a good, I mean, there's a handful of good interviews with Chris Nash ahead of the release of this film. Of course, I'm always going to be partial to the one done by friend of the podcast, friend of the site, Megan Navarro, who interviewed Nash for Bloody Disgusting. And there's a couple of points in their conversation that really just kind of clicked for me. One of them is that he talks a lot about his um, he and his DP talking about this as sort of like a nature documentary, right? Which I think goes to both the style of shooting as well as the sound design elements. Very naturalistic, very diegetic sound. There's not really, to my recollection, there's not a lot of soundtrack stuff. If there's a lot of soundtrack, there's no ambience. Like it's all just sort of what you would hear in this environment, which is a lot harder. It's easy to do and a lot harder to do well than I think we probably give it credit for. But there was also a line that he said, which is my favorite. So I wrote it down to quote it here. Talking about the look of the film, he said, "No look is also a look. So this is very much a no tone is a tone type of movie." And I think that's such a cool way of looking at it because it's hard to articulate when you're watching it. It helps to understand, nature documentary. It helps to understand slasher stuff and things like that. But there isn't in an era where we're still so obsessed with late 80s horror where everything has to have an aesthetic that's like turned up to 11. We need John Carpenter on steroids. We need, you know, every great slasher franchise just like dialed up as hard as we can go. Just by the nature that this doesn't do that feels distinct. Part of that, as we always talk about on the show, is how much of that does this movie work in counterpoint? If this film came out when everybody was doing this, would we feel the same way about it? Probably not. But to sort of go in a mode where everybody's like trying to do, and I'll use Psycho Gorman because I think that's a really fun example, but everybody's trying to put their aesthetic mark to do the most of something and be the filmmaker that does things this way, a Baskin, a Psycho Gorman, whatever. This isn't doing anything. No tone is a tone. And I really, really like that about it.
Yeah, no tone is a tone. And also, if you look at the 80s slashers that went super campy and fun and tried to do that tone, that is not necessary here. I mean, the title is In a Violent Nature, and having the film be stripped of a soundtrack and all these other high entertainment value things where there's no needle drops of that nature, there's no moments where we're trying to be goofy funny. All those moments are happening, but we don't see them because once again the title is in a violent nature, and we want to basically interrogate the slasher film and the structure and say, well, what is it when we boil it down to just the kills and the deaths? Like what is this movie we are watching in a sense of, we'll watch a slasher with our friends to have fun. We'll watch something like Deathgasm, go down the line. Like
Mm-hmm.
we know what we're getting with those. But I think the commentary here being what those movies look like when you take out all the elements that give it a pass in our minds, that make it entertaining and palatable and all those other things, and what we're left with. And that is the horror of it. Like that's the horrifying element of watching this film and having it just be a straightforward line. Like this is just a path from A to B. There's a start and there's a finish. People die along the way. There's nothing else to kind of fluff it up. There's nothing else to make it that really fun midnight watch, because that's not what we're trying to do here. And I think that point of view and that storytelling is also really interesting. Like so many slashers have tried to do that before and take like the serious approach and have come off like goofy or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think In a Violent Nature is a good example of a slasher film that confronts the violence and puts it on display with great deal. Again, like I'm
Hmm.
very appreciative of the special effects. Like it all looks magnificent, but for what the story we're telling and what that means to like how we're analyzing slasher films through this lens, it's a really, again, interesting and unique way of putting it all forward and saying like, okay, like the slasher film is just about the slasher and kills. Everything else like doesn't really matter, and what happens when it's not there.
You talked a bit about the you know, the deconstruction element of this, and I really like this. I think this is a really interesting way of doing it, but I think it's also fun to talk about, so we should talk about it. This could be the second or third film in a series in terms of the way that they unpack the world, what has happened with Johnny before, what could happen with Johnny again, right? They set this up so that there is kind of a, I mean, this is like Friday the 13th part 2 in terms of what it could be to the characters that exist in this world. And then again, that's another thing that if you do it wrong, it could be really like, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. All of this has happened before. All of this will happen again. That could be a really heavy handed and silly metaphor. But again, because we're so locked into the perspective of Johnny, and because Johnny is just a beast who's kind of like going through this and doesn't care what might have happened in the past and is just sort of like doing what he has been made to do, it ends up working so really well. And I wonder why, if you agree with me, why you think it works so well, because I've been trying to puzzle that particular piece over how it manages to pull off being it kind of like its own sequel, but not having that feel forced.
So I think it works well enough. I think this is one of those other things that bothered me a little bit about it, where it is what you just said. It feels like this movie picks up as a part two, where part one is kind of ended a little while ago.
Hmm.
We don't get any of that backstory because that's not the purpose here. We just hit the ground running and we were just in this story, which horror films have done before. Like horror films have dropped us into a middle of an ongoing scenario
Oh
and
yeah.
we've been able to follow it beforehand and we're able to follow it here. Like we know the drill, but in the way the movie starts and ends, it does feel like we are missing one or two like just crucial pieces. It feels like we're just missing a little bit of quote unquote structure that is obviously missing for once again intended reasons. Like I think
Hmm.
Nash was really meticulous with every choice he made. It's whether or not that choice works for you. And I that element for me kind of joins my problems with the end and that really just lingering I need this to end scene where I almost get it if you end the movie shorter, the front to back makes more sense not having that explanation, but diving so much into the end it's just something that kept me a little farther away from it. And I think that's where I ultimately lose a little bit of that. I get why everyone, or I shouldn't say everyone, but I get why a lot of people are over the moon with this movie and saying it's the next great thing and the next thing you can't miss. And I do think this is a great film you should seek out and watch. Like support. The more we support movies like this, the more they get out there, the more they're spread around, the more risks other filmmakers are willing to take.
Yeah.
But I am just worried that this is another one that's going to get caught in the festival pre-show hype machine that everyone talks about it as the next big thing. And I don't want people to go in with that expectation because I think it's going to be really divisive and it's going to be not a lot of people's bag who are getting sold this like really subversive one of a kind slasher that they think is probably going to be one thing and it's not going to be that thing. And I worry about
Yeah.
that a little bit because I'm already seeing it on my timeline. I'm already seeing people walk out going, well, this thing was overhyped to hell. I mean, like, shout out Freddie, like Freddie of the board game fame. We all know him on Twitter. And he's one of the first tweets I saw being like, yeah, hype got me on this one. It's a 3 out of 5. It's fine, but wow, was that like a gimmick that I didn't need for the whole runtime? And that's gonna be the killer. That's gonna be the thing that I think turns a lot of people off. That this is one of those movies that really leans into what it is. And I love that confidence. I'm going to take that every other day. Like I'm going to take that every time in the future,
Big
but that
swings.
doesn't mean I'm going to like it 10 out of 10 every time. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just really like stuck on how this is going to be received this weekend, let's say, when everyone starts to really see it.
Yeah. And I'll circle back to the end because I think the end is make or break for a lot of folks in this movie. Again, we're trying really hard not to deal with spoilers here, but it ends with a conversation that isn't what you think a movie like this should end on. We'll put it like that. Um, there's tension in it, and then as you realize the tension might be misguided, it starts to fade a little bit, and then the scene continues, and it's very long for what it is. And I was into it in the moment, which was surprising for me because I'm so conscious of. I mean, there's I complain about the Power to this day because the last 5 minutes of the Power ruined what were in my book. A Perfect Shutters the Power was a perfect movie up to that point. But what I will say about the ending is, if we think of this as a nature documentary, if we think of this as trying to make sense of acts of random naturalistic violence, survival of the fittest type stuff, nature doesn't have logic or reason, it just is. It made me think of growing up, and every person in my family had a copy of Alaska Bear Tales and More Alaska Bear Tales, which is a very Alaska thing, but they were books about bear attacks where you would have one on the shelf and they all had the same kind of creepy, like snarling bear cover. And they were all stories about people who survived a bear attack. And they were horrifying when you're like 9 years old, about reading how somebody's like flesh was torn away from their face and how they had to play dead. And like, but all of the books after the fact were them trying to be like, this horrible, horrible thing happened, and them trying to understand why they survived, or how they survived, or what it all mattered. So the more that I thought about it after the movie was over, the more I realized that there is sort of like an Alaska Bear Tales vibe to the way this movie ends, which is just, there isn't an explanation. Like you ran afoul of Mother Nature, of the forces of natural violence, and some people live and some people don't, and that's just how it is. And the ending is sort of a testament to trying to understand the ununderstandable, which was, again, like such a tough decision to make in the face of everything that came before. A lot of people are going to hate it, and I get it, but it worked for me.
Yeah, and I love a film that doesn't answer everything and leaves you thinking and leaves you kind of just stewing with what you just watched. Don't get me wrong on that. I just think the way that this film decides to do that
Mhm.
meanders, and that's my killing point. Like that's that point that dropped it, from that 4.5, let's say, that is the next tier, to, like, again, 3.5, really respectable film I liked and you should watch. It's all those things. I'm just trying to temper expectations a tad, for those who have the same mind as me. No one's wrong. I'm
Yes.
not saying anyone is wrong here for thinking it is the next great thing, and I'm happy people do. Like, it's freaking awesome. Again, I want movies like this to get spread because more of them get made like that. But for me, really good time, really good time as a little slasher flick that is trying to do something that no one else is doing. So it's kudos for that.
And there you have it. And A Violent Nature is going to be in theaters this weekend. We won't often, actually, we probably won't very much at all talk about new releases on Uncertified. We're probably going to try and give a little bit of distance, a couple of months or something, for the kind of films we talk about. It gives us an opportunity to let you get a chance to see it. That's kind of the thing we like to do, is like, we want you to be understanding the movie we're talking about for this part of the show. But if you liked what you heard today, if you want to hear about more films like this, go to certifiedforgotten.com, go to patreon.com/certifiedforgotten and sign up for our free newsletter. We've got a really awesome selection of writers and episodes coming up for you, and we want you to be a part of it. Donato, any last promotions or bumps before we head out?
As always, Donato Bomb, DonatoBomb, Twitter, Letterbox, Instagram, TikTok, anywhere there's a social, I'm probably on it. So Donato Bomb, follow me.
Awesome. Thank you for listening. We will see you next week for a full 1 hour episode of Certified Forgotten.